As the Trump administration works to negotiate an end to the Russia-Ukraine war, it's also making moves to penalize countries that are financially supporting Moscow. Now, one major player in the crosshairs is India. U.S. imports from India were already set to face a 25% tariff that's starting today. But yesterday, President Trump announced an additional 25% import tax, bringing that total to 50%. It's going to go into effect in 3 weeks. The reason? India buys Russian oil. Now, the president has also accused the Indian government of selling oil on the open market, quote, for big profits. By the way, the U.S. imported more than $87 billion in goods from India last year, placing it among our nation's top 10 trading partners. And these new tariffs could mean higher prices on products ranging from pharmaceuticals to jewelry and textiles. And joining us to explain what could happen next is CBS News national security contributor Sam Vinograd. Sam, really appreciate you being here. This is a very novel use of tariffs. Normally you see countries do sanctions. What's the motivation behind President Trump's strategy here? And do you think there's any indication that this is going to move the needle with Russia?
Well, U.S. strategy to end the war in Ukraine has really been pegged to the assessment that the economy is Putin's soft spot. Because of that, the U.S. goal, along with several European countries, has been to put enough economic pressure on Russia that they feel forced to come to the negotiating table to get economic relief and then ultimately to end the war in Ukraine. That's why the United States, European countries, G7 countries prohibited the direct import of Russian oil into their countries. And then they set a price cap, a price at which other countries could buy Russian oil without facing penalties. That price cap was below the market value of Russian oil on the open market. So India, China, and Turkey started buying a lot more Russian oil, ostensibly below this price cap of $60 a barrel. But now President Trump is really putting in place what we call secondary sanctions. He's punishing India for buying Russian oil. The key question here is whether Trump decides to take similar action against China, which buys a lot more Russian oil than India does.
Well, those are my two questions, Sam. I mean, first, did that Biden policy to cap the price per barrel at $60 for Russian oil, did that backfire because it just drove a lot of countries to buy the cheaper Russian oil, which was then fueling, Russia's economy and this war? That's number one. And number two, why not go after China if you really want to hurt Russian oil revenue?
Well, the price caps and the sanctions on direct Russian imports of oil, of European and U.S. imports of Russian oil did shift energy markets and drove a lot more Russian oil to China, India, and Turkey, just to name a few. What we know is that in foreign policy, there's often competing priorities. And we know that when it comes to China, President Trump does appear intent on trying to push Russia to the negotiating table to increase the economic pressure. But also we know that President Trump is very focused on getting a trade deal with China and not doing anything to upset the apple cart when it comes to trade negotiations. So ultimately, it will be up to President Trump to decide what's more of a priority, really ramping up the economic pressure on Putin by putting secondary sanctions on China because of their purchases of Russian oil, or trying to maintain trade negotiations with China and keeping the status quo.
Well, I think that's a really important point that you made about trade negotiations, Sam, because, of course, China is a major trading partner, much more than India. Actually, Peter Navarro was asked about this yesterday, why they aren't going after China. And he said, we don't want to get to a point where we actually hurt ourselves because you could start to see a trade war. But I did want to ask you, let's say this works. Let's say India plays ball and says, hey, I'm not going to go buy Russian oil. They've got to go buy that from somewhere else, though. So what do you think that might do to global oil prices and then gas prices here at home?
Well, certainly during the Biden administration, there was a concern that putting these secondary sanctions in place on India, China, and others could really roil energy markets. Since that time, though, it is worth noting that U.S. production of energy has increased and global energy markets have withstood supply shocks. So even if secondary sanctions are put in place on India and China and even Turkey, if those do go into effect, I do think we're in a different place from an energy market perspective than we were several years ago.
All right, Sam Vinograd, thank you so much.